great Mark McGregor. Mark is here with me. I was with Mark in Amsterdam just probably a few weeks back, and it's wonderful again to be collaborating with him. Those of you who attend our events, you'll be familiar with Mark and his work he has shared with us on enterprise architecture, on process management, process mining, RPA, and today he turns his attention to intelligent business process management. Mark has more than 25 years of experience across vendors, analyst firms, and end user organizations. He always has interesting insights to share, and they're often the driver of lively discussions. So don't save any of your questions for later. This is the time to ask the tough questions because there is a great leader there who can handle them. So Mark, thank you for being here and sharing your wisdom with our global audience today.
Thanks, Jose, for that too kind introduction. Absolutely, as you say, fantastic that we actually got some time, FaceTime together there in Amsterdam, and here we are back in the virtual world. Great to have everyone with us today. Looking forward to this session, and hopefully, as Jose was alluding to, giving you some alternative ways of thinking about things so that we can go. So let's get the presentation back up, and here we go. Right, there we go. So we're all up and running. Excellent. So the criticality and re-emergence of iBPMS, but not as you know it. So, you know, many of you will have been around for a lot of years and heard a lot of the stuff around the iBPMS market. And I think it's a really, interesting market, very, very nuanced. But I also think that it's a market that's in a massive state of flux as we all rethink what it is that we need from an iBPMS, how we're going to use it, and why we should do it. So a little bit of a history lesson to start with. Any of you that have attended previous iBPMS events will know that a sometime speaker is a very old and very good friend of mine, dear friend of mine, Jim Siner. So Jim originally created the iBPMS definitions and market way back in 2011 when he was still with Gartner. When he was looking at what you see here in the center is that really crowded BPMS marketplace full of players, and said, well, we need to find a better way to differentiate some of those and to be looking at saying, well, where is the market headed and what do people need to be looking at? So we can see that from the 2010 BPMS Magic Quadrant, then suddenly in September 2012, when we look at it as the iBPMS, and by the way, I know that the traditional BPMS Magic Quadrant was still going then and in parallel, but we suddenly see that actually all of those people that were saying that they were doing BPM actually don't fit the definition that Jim came up with for iBPMS. So we suddenly see a much easier and simpler landscape. So three of the core areas that Jim identified as differentiating between what was then, shall we say, traditional BPMS and iBPMS were that the iBPMSs were going to be more social. Okay, so they provide greater context and greater meaning by including additional extra data sources to allow us to create that bigger picture, to work on more things, and allow more ad hoc interactions and more discovery between knowledge workers across systems, etc. And this was a real shake-up for many of these vendors who were really very focused on saying, I have an integrated platform that's going to automate everything, and it all happens inside my product, never mind my platform. He also saw even then that actually we were going to be looking to not just use the applications on mobile devices, but making inquiries of things like our analytics, our data, alerts, all of these kind of things to remain productive while we're on the go. And the third area was the area of analytics. Now, Jim had been a great proponent of the value and importance of business activity monitoring for many years before that. And it's an area where any of you that considered buying systems back in that time will know that it was really confusing. As vendors, we can take any term that everyone understands and make it so that you no longer understand what it means. Because suddenly business activity monitoring meant you can monitor the process that you execute in the system that you build using my platform. The fact that that might only be less than 1% of the activities your business undertakes doesn't matter. We can check the box. We've got business activity monitoring. So Jim saw that we needed a broader way of covering the analytics, and not just historical analytics, but on demand. Hey, I need to know more about this. What does this mean if, etc., etc., so that we can get into some of that predictive analysis and more around the process optimization. Now, you'll know that these are things that I've talked about a little in previous sessions when we've been looking at process mining and process monitoring. So it will come as no surprise to say, well, actually, here we are 11, 12 years on, and we're only just getting it. So what else has changed? So some other things that Jim identified. So if you go Googling, you'll find those three things, and lots of vendors talk about those three buckets. Yeah, we're doing all that. But actually what Jim said is, here's the 10 core components that you need if you want to be considered as an iBPMS. Yes, of course, you need that process automation, process orchestration engine, but you also need a model-driven composition environment so that you're looking at model-driven development, not code. We need content interaction management because we need to be interacting with content beyond just the pieces in the application. We need to handle human interaction management. Now, we can look at that as saying, well, lots of people did that as their automation, but we can remember that actually a lot of that is simple workflow. We need greater connectivity within and across systems. I've already talked about the active analytics, and another way of looking at that is continuous intelligence. I need that continuous insight and the ability to take action based on that. I need to be looking at things like business rules. I need a really good process component repository registry so that I can store all of my processes, so that I can look at the cross-process impacts. And when we look at all those things, we can see that actually the people that purported to be iBPMS, and I'm going to bring them back up again now just as a reminder, actually started to fall by the way. So going back and we look at that BPM moving to iBPMS, then we have the question of where are they now? You know, some of you may be aware of some of these great names of the past, and some of you may be aware of the fact that they have largely disappeared. So, you know, here's my logos of some that have disappeared. Now, they've not just disappeared in terms of companies gone away. Most of it was through mergers and acquisitions. But some of it is they've taken the concepts of what they had around that connectivity, etc., and just moved into another market. So anyone that's searching around Bosch Software Innovations will find that they've not actually gone away. They're still doing stuff, but they're very focused on the IoT style of automation. And the same thing goes with some of the others. They've not actually disappeared, other than the fact that the technology they had doesn't play in the market where it is. Because for a lot of people, when they looked at the 10 core components, it was actually more of a checkbox. So another way of looking at those, 10 pieces is that the iBPMS as it was in 2011, right the way through until people largely stopped talking about it, even though it's still out there now, is still driven around an automation engine. So it's about automation, and I'm going to sell you automation, and here's some other things I have to do around the side to sell you automation. And the rationale between the greens and the yellows here is many of them will tell you that they've got modeling, but they're not really model driven. You know, I wrote about it when I was with MWD Advisors many years ago as an analyst, is that what they were creating largely are visual programming environments. I can enable you to build the model to automate the process. The fact that the model that you're building is one piece of your order to cash, which is automated only in one area, I don't know about the rest of the processes. I don't know about your value chains. I don't know how it connects to resource. So it's very lightweight. It's not truly model driven. It's really visual programming, but it's enough to check the box. Many will say that they have a repository. You think that's great. So how do I store all my manual? Oh, well, you don't store the manual processes here. We only store the processes that you've automated using our automation engine or the associated artifacts. But nonetheless, we can say we've got a repository, so check the box. As I've already mentioned, we've got the analytics now, whether we look at active and on demand, they've got them and they do a pretty good job for the most part. But they're only analytics on what's going on inside the applications that you create using that automation engine. Yes, they've done a reasonable job of content interaction, but it's, again, the content that you need to drive the automated process. Rules, most of them have done a pretty good job in terms of bringing in the rules, and there is an argument that says actually building a rules-driven system can be one of the more effective models that you can do rather than a process way. So the areas in green, they absolutely nailed, but the areas in yellow, I'm going to argue that for the most part was a checkbox. And so for many of those of us that are on a call like this or attend some of the other events, whether it's the business transformation, the operational excellence, will know that yes, we're increasingly looking to apply more and more digital automation to aspects of our business, but we're using different automation. We're using RPA, we're using low code, no code. We may still be using ERP. We may still want to be building things with BPMS. So the question then becomes, is the traditional iBPMS approach that's centered around a singular automation engine the right vehicle to address the whole range of challenges that we're facing around the organization? And taking that automation-centric approach also leads us to, let's just build this, I didn't realize it was going to build, my apologies. So pose the question, are we doing the right things right? So we know that just doing things is neither particularly efficient nor particularly effective. We know that if we take it and we automate it, then that's good because now we're doing things right. We're doing it faster. We're not doing it in the dumb ways that we were. We've become a lot more efficient. Okay. Or we've taken little pieces where we think we can do the right things. But in that purely automation-centric approach to iBPMS, I'm going to question that, do you have the ability to know, never mind be sure, whether you're doing the right things right? Because it appears to me that you've already decided what the solution is and you're building a solution to solve a particular problem. And it's the classic issues of many Lean and Six Sigma shops of the past, right? Everyone working in small groups and working really, really hard to sub-optimize the whole, because no one was actually looking at the broader picture. And only when we look at the whole can we identify which areas are where we should, could, and can apply the right process improvements and apply the right technologies in order to bring them forward. So I'm going to suggest to you that the 10 core competencies make perfect sense, but that to get the most out of it, we need to rethink what's at the core. And it'll come to no surprise for anyone that's known me over a number of years, I believe that the core element is actually the modeling. Because when we look at, and I was going to get too busy putting the whole 10 things around, but if we wrap them up and say, well, actually, a modeling-based approach gives me the repository that I can store all types of processes, whether they're at the value chain level, whether at the procedure level, at the process level. Wow, I can have a whole process architecture stored. I can understand the interconnectivity in one place, and I can do the impact analysis. That's a real process repository. I can already run discovery, and yeah, using things like process mining and task mining, I need to do and have automated discovery. But automated discovery doesn't help me figure out how Jose and I may work together on a new book, because no amount of process mining or task mining is going to figure that out. Sorry, there is a fact that says when we're doing the interviews and the old world of post-it notes, interviews, time and motions, there is still a place for that. And that if we want a really, truly useful iBPMS, then it needs to make sure that it can help us with both manual and automated, so that we get that full 360-degree view. Never mind the fact that, I would argue that it needs to cover process, journeys, and rule-stroke decisions. That's a whole another level of complexity. But then when we look at the automation, we don't want to be tied, as I say, to a single automation solution. We know that we're going to be dealing with human workflow, so we do want the ability to undertake workflow management. We do know that there is a time and a place for putting in low code, no code. We know that there are some things that are more complicated, more scalable, more enterprise centric, that still need the value and structure that running a traditional BPMS type system will bring us. And we also know that whether we like it or not, significant parts of our organization are still reliant upon running using package applications of one kind or another. And that's not changing from on-prem to the cloud. In some ways, in a cloud-based world, we seem to be using even more applications than ever we were before. So our iBPMS needs to be able to help us manage all of those different requirements, manage all those different types of process, know that we can see them in a totally interconnected way, and not be wedded to any single technology. And just as another example here, let's use the example of RPA. I mean, I didn't mention it explicitly here, but if you think about RPA, if you don't model the requirements, work instructions for your robot separately to your implementation, you've got some real problems, because how do you move from whether it's a Blue Prism to an automation anywhere to a UI path, pick and mix? You suddenly can't without having to go back and do all of the rework again. If you separate the concern of the model and the work instructions and the procedural information that you want to use to drive the bot, then you're going to find it a lot easier to migrate from vendor to vendor, or indeed upgrade from bot to bot. So we need that separation. And then on the management level, then we need to know that we've got that combination of the process monitoring, and anyone knows that I'm a real believer in the value of the process mining technologies, but actually it's the process monitoring that gives us the process intelligence. It enables us to act when before we didn't even know we needed to act, so we can get more just-in-time actions going on. We need the action engine so that it provides us with alerts and options so that we can start to make changes. We know that as we become more automated, that the fact is that continuous improvement for the 21st century is going to be increasingly reliant on our ability to get data in context from inside systems rather than from in people's minds. And so actually, we don't just want to automate, we want to be constantly improving and constantly changing. Now, there's a whole school of thought out there that we're potentially going to see new processes created on the fly based on the data that's suddenly going to say, actually, there's a new way of offering. It's a little bit like the Minority Report, if any of you remember, where he's walking down the street and the shops are all calling out to him, hey, I've just noticed you've been paid today. I've got this great offer, and that new pair of shoes that you looked at last week, there's another flavor of those coming in. And these things are being created on the fly. And then the last point that I raise on here is the area of scenario simulation. So it's not just about simulating a process in isolation, but if we're going to start changing things around, putting in bots, are we looking at the whole scenario? So I think, and by the way, the content piece, is more deeper. I'm talking about here almost a lightweight content management, because I'm recognizing that still, there's some statistics that I was looking at the other week, and I can't remember who it was, so forgive me on this, but still only 20 to 30% of processes are automated. This means that there's still 70% of processes that are carried out by people. So they need some degree of work instruction, some procedures, etc. And their procedures need to be versioned. Therefore, we need some degree of content management in there. So my assertion is that what we're seeing is a new flavor of iBPMS, and it's a re-emergence because all of the core competencies are all required, but the value isn't by having automation at the core, it's actually having modeling at the core. And I'm obviously not the only one that thinks this, so I thought that, in case some of you had questions, that it might be worth just taking a step back just for a few minutes and saying, well, okay, is anyone taking this modeling centric based approach? And the answer is, yeah, there are 4 vendors that spring to my mind that have done it to one way, shape or another. So Signavio, many of you be familiar with, obviously, with the SAP acquisition. But if you think about it, that was exactly where Signavio worked with the business transformation suite. They were covering the modeling and the mining and some automation, and I'll come back to the some automation piece in a moment. Software AG has been very centered around this for a long time. GB Tech are kind of there, and I put them there because if you go looking at the website, then they'll look to have most of the pieces, and indeed on the automation area, they're doing pretty well in the rankings of their automation piece alone. iGraphics, some of you will have seen recently, acquired a process mining vendor and are putting all those pieces together. So the 4 that I've picked on all offer some degree of automation. Now, obviously, the strongest mainstream automation there is Software AG, which I would argue is both a strength and a weakness, because if you've invested in that full-blown automation of Software AG, you could be becoming a little trapped, by my previous graphic. But in the case of the Signavios, the iGraphics, and the GB Tech, it's less about automation to compete with mainstream automation products. It's firstly about saying, actually, we spend all this time talking about process improvement, and so often those of us that do process improvement don't spend much time improving the process of process improvement, or we talk about automation, but we don't look at automating the work that we do in process improvement. So a lot of the automation that the modeling tool vendors are providing is around that human workflow. So the human workflow, here's how we can make sure we're getting the right versions of work instructions out in the right places. Here's how we're reviewing processes on a regular basis. And that was the start for a lot of their automation. But what's been fascinating, and certainly saw it in a couple of these vendors, is that actually the clients themselves will say, well, actually, that lightweight automation that you've been providing, that's really great, because you know what? There's a whole bunch of other use cases that I have that just want simple, lightweight, human-centric workflow. Can I use it for that? And it's bubbled out. So there are 4 vendors that in my mind are very much iBPMS vendors of the future. Below my dotted line, I mentioned the Pega, the IBM, and the Nintex, because you can look at it as saying, well, hang on a minute, these guys say they've got all the pieces. Well, in the case of Pega, of course, Pega is still predominantly focused on applications, and anything that they're building, even though they have a model-centric approach, is still about building Pega systems. So whilst they kind of are there, I don't think that they're in the same way. IBM certainly have all the pieces, but as we all know, are still largely leading with their automation and adding on the other pieces around the edge. The model isn't the center of the universe, in my opinion, with IBM. They can tell me they've got the products like BlueWorks, etc., but it's not the center of the universe. And actually, the parts are far more loosely coupled. So they're worth a mention, but I don't see them as being in that modeling-based iBPMS. Nintex, our sponsor of today, and the talk we had earlier, I've got some interesting pieces. They're certainly wedded to modeling through the acquisition that they made some years ago of ProMat. So they've got definitely, there in terms of some semi-professional modeling, but they've got a slight weakness in my mind in that they're not really covering the process mining, but certainly one to watch. So not to be ignored, but those are the four that I see. So another way of visualizing it, and some of you have seen I've used this graphic before in a slightly different way, is that the iBPMS platform, in terms of that connecting people and systems, it needs to be something that gets the collaboration, leverages the wisdom of the crowd. So yeah, we've got some manual discovery to do there, which can inform the modeling, which can then produce the documentation, mobile devices, whatever it is we need, so that for the manual procedures we're underway. We can capture from customer systems and operational systems through the automated discovery to inform, enrich the modeling to get that greater picture. Those models, of course, can then be used to drive the automation and the scripting for the automation either into the operational systems or out through the journeys, all within the platform from a workflow perspective. The automation, of course, connecting with the monitoring so that we can undertake simulation, and that's really an area of weakness for many products, certainly not so much so for the full modeling type based ones that I mentioned, because when we're starting to do those predictive analytics and predicting what's going on, we want to be feeding that monitoring data into a really rich and capable discrete event simulation. It's too often too easy to feed it into simple simulation. So we can feed the simulation, which can inform the models, and we can take the monitoring, which that line should be the other way around, so that the monitoring is actually informing the modeling. And one of the things that I love is watching monitoring data being used in traditional BPMN style models and just bringing those models to life and turning some of those dusty, static maps that everyone says are not worth doing into living, breathing, decision-making vehicles that everyone's using. Massive potential there. So that combination of people, process, and systems. So a few points that I would suggest that you might want to consider when you're selecting the iBPMS that works for you. As I've mentioned, please make sure that your models are and can be decoupled from the implementation technology. I know it sounds strange, but often the processes will outlive the technology that we're using to implement them. And I use the example of RPA. This will almost certainly be the case. I don't know whether you guys have come across it, but I've had a number of people over the last few weeks talking to me about the fact that they're having to either, I'm going to say in their instance, they said they cut back or stopped using RPA, okay, which seemed a little drastic. But what they're saying is they can no longer run some of the package application upgrades that they wanted to, because when they put in the new interface, it breaks the RPA. And then they're back at square one again, having to rerun the recording, rerun all the details, reprogram the bot, and they're starting all the way over from scratch. And so for some people, they're now questioning whether actually the time taken to do that was actually worthwhile. So not the case for everyone, and I'm not suggesting that everyone's having that problem, but certainly an increasing number of people are telling me that actually it's not a one-off cost, there's a constant cost there. Some of that decoupling can help some of those things. I talked about the fact that your chosen iBPMS should support and address all types of the automation that you're looking to do, are likely to do, and will want to do in the future. Don't get sucked into the we can do it all. Rarely are you going to get that from an automation vendor. The modeling vendors have been, agnostic to this point for many, many years. And even when they're shipping with their own automation capability, they know that it's only for some use cases. So even when they're shipping with that, they're providing the connectivity and the ability to feed that data into other systems. Just again to remind ourselves that process monitoring is actually more valuable than process mining. And even if you don't necessarily agree with that, just remember that when you're applying process mining in isolation, that you're mining a process. But that process doesn't exist in isolation. You know, I was thinking about it only yesterday. We talk about mining order to cash or procure to pay, but they're not separate processes if I'm a wholesaler in the retail type trade, because I probably buy on a sale or return. So there's a very deep coupling between my procure to pay and my order to cash. But I can't see that when I'm only mining order to cash or procure to pay. It's only when I take those models and store them externally in a process-centric repository that I can start to see how those things are going on. Which leads on to my point 4. You know, processes don't exist in isolation. So, you know, your chosen solution needs to store and have the ability to connect all the different types of process that are running within your organization. And the last point, the ability to generate, communicate, and manage work instructions is still as important as the ability to automate. Now, those work instructions are indeed also not just for our human workers, but often now for our digital workers too. So hopefully that's given you some things to think about in terms of, you know, iBPMS is absolutely not going away. It's absolutely a crucial piece of technology, but actually the way that you've been thinking about and the way that some vendors have been positioning themselves in terms of being an iBPMS player, then I'm going to suggest that actually in today's world, iBPMS is not the people that they thought they were. And with that, I'm going to see, Jose, whether we have any questions. So I'm going to stop sharing that and bring you back.
Mark. We do have questions here for you. And the very first question is coming from Matt Ham. And Matt's asking, if you could please expand on your thoughts on separating RPA modeling instructions from implementation.
Yeah, so the first thing to say is, you know, they're already separated. It's just that most people that are paying the money don't realize they're separated. Because if we think about it, when I buy most traditional RPA tools, they're going to give me a desktop recorder, which is going to go and record the interactions. And let's not get into the tangents of, well, what can they capture and not capture? Because any of you that use Macs will know that says, oh, the desktop recorder doesn't work on that. It only there's a whole bunch of caveats. So great, I've run the desktop recorder, so now I can use that to program the bot. Well, actually, no. What we generate from the recorder is something we call a PDD. Great, so that's a standard document. Well, actually, it's not a standard document. Every vendor's implemented it differently. Okay, well, what is it? Oh, it's just a structured Word document that you give to the developer, who then goes into the RPA development environment and uses that to tell him what to program. Oh, hang on a minute. So that package that you told me was already totally separated. But what I was driving at here is, well, if that's the case, then you know what? I might as well say, hey, I don't want to be limited to your desktop recorder, Mr. RPA vendor, that's only working and generating your PDDs. I may as well look at a third-party task mining tool that can work, shall we say, either from the cloud or on, and work in all the environments. Oh, and can generate the PDD if it's going to do that, that's capable of being used by all of the different vendors rather than just one.
And Mark, on the discussions related to intelligent business process management, intelligent automation in general, one of the questions that came up that I thought was quite interesting was about your perspective with being kind of like in pandemic mode where everything has accelerated for now a couple of years. And if you look back, what do you see happening in the industry? What kind of trends have emerged in the last couple of years that you have noticed, and not only really related to RPA, process mining, intelligent automation in general? What are you seeing?
So I think that we're seeing, I mean, the whole thing is fascinating and exciting. So there's so many things that we've obviously seen a lot more of the increase of, shall we say, the application of digital workers. Now, this is one that, I've followed for many years. I was talking to BPM Next a few years ago, because I think that I love the fact that we need to think about human resources for digital workers. If I'm going to interview you, I have my interview questions. I ask you what your skills are. We tell you what the job description is. I provide you with training. And so, well, actually, I do that for digital workers too. That's right, but let's carry it on. But I do it, I'm sorry, but you've got to have a performance appraisal every year, and we get to check back whether you're delivering what you thought you were doing. Oh, and I'm really sorry, but you're not delivering, Jose, so we need to let you go. So I've now got to bring someone new on and retrain them. Or we're coming, you and I are of a certain age, and who knows how long before we say, we're in for retirement. So, do you know what, that hire to retire process everyone talks about, we need the same for our digital workers. Now, whether that's an RPA based system or any other system, we need the same things. And we've not put those in place. I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen around the digital workers in the pandemic world, and I think it's becoming a bigger issue for millennials, and I think that in this instance is one where a big thumbs up, is the issue of trust. Oh, right, you're going to put all these systems in because you don't trust me. Well, if you don't trust me, you know what? I don't trust you. And I think that it's great to see some of these debates that we've got going on about trust, and reminding people that trust is a two-way street. I mean, you and I were talking in Amsterdam, and we were both chuckling, and many of the people on this call are going to be falling into the trap that so much of the money that they have spent on that automation, the systems, the rules, is because somebody didn't trust somebody. And that actually, with better education, better trust, and better communication, they can solve many of the process problems. They can eliminate waste because they're creating work for the sake of it, and they don't even need to do the automation. But no longer are we actually willing to have the adult discussions. And I think that's why I'm going to give credit to the millennials, because I think with the great resignation and the such like going on, we're going to see that there are going to be a lot of leadership teams that are going to have to come back and say, these systems to monitor this, these systems to dictate that, maybe that's what's causing us to lose people. And so the great opportunity, but I think great to be having some intelligent debate over what's going on. And the second point that I would make, and I made this point in Amsterdam, is I get a little tired about hearing about intelligent automation, because very few people have shown me any intelligence in their automation. I built expert systems in the 1990s, and I haven't seen anything that anyone's showing me that isn't similar. And that expert system meant that someone, me and others, we had to sit down and write down all of the things that might go on. Yes, I agree. The system worked out and said, oh, if this happens, it means that. But someone had to give it all the conditions. It didn't think for itself. It wasn't overly intelligent.
This is such a terrific point, Mark, because we have been around for a while, and we have seen a lot of different waves of automation come through and intelligent automation come through. But if we look at, and if we believe some of the numbers on digital transformation failures, and Brent Kurgiesk from Shell just before your talk was discussing around 84% failure, but the failure rates are high. But if you and I look at those failures, they are most often driven by some missing component on the human connection, right? And it's not like because the AI system, the SAP HANA ERP with advanced artificial intelligence fail. It is because people have a hard time, trusting, collaborating effectively, understanding what their current process even is. I mean, some really basic stuff that has nothing to do with technology. I mean, why have we been so stuck Can it be because we're focusing too much on technology and we're missing some of these fundamental things, and we keep like saying, oh, technology is going to take care of those fundamental things, and it doesn't? I'm curious about your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll be interested. So I'll give you a perspective. It'll be interesting to see whether it mirrors what you're seeing yourselves. So if we go back 20 years, and we both did a lot of the operational excellence, Lean, Six Sigma, all of those conferences, we've been doing them for a long time. And it was like a death march, right, for a software vendor to go and exhibit. Because I'm a master black belt in Six Sigma, I don't need none of that automation stuff. And it's like, no, it was heresy. I don't need it. I can do it all on the back of a cigarette packet. We don't document anything. Okay, that's interesting. And then we go to the technology conferences, and it's get that process. It's just analysis, design. No, we don't need it. Here, let me show you how to build a system. So we've got one group of people that are so focused on building the system. Now, in fairness, that's probably, we go back to that communication thing. It's because they can't figure out how to be trusted by the process people, who can't actually give them the information in the way that they want. When they do give them the information, from the IT perspective, then we're going to show them a BPMN model that says this is how it's done. And we've been around long enough, and I always use the data modeling analogy because I think it really drives it home. I've never met a CEO that can't draw a conceptual data model. I've got customers, they give me orders, I get cash. Box line, box line. And he can explain the data model of his business. And then someone says, well, that's not a real data model. Yes, it is. Yeah, but what about the one-to-one, one-to-many? He doesn't care. For him to explain his business, he doesn't need more detail. So he gives it to a data modeler. So the data modeler says, right, well, okay, we're going to have a primary key here. There's a one-to-one management, and draws out the logical data model, which it can share widely with application teams, other data models, and everyone says, that's great. We can agree that that's our logical data model. The DBA says, well, there's no way I'm going to go and implement that. It's great, but I need a more detailed model that's properly tuned because we're going to implement in Oracle. So he goes and he adds some extra keys here and moves things around there to optimize that model, that physical model for Oracle. Now, someone says, well, that's okay, but I'm implemented down in Brazil and we use SQL Server. So I'm going to take that same logical model and I'm going to create a new physical model with all of the detail on to implement in SQL. And it all works well. And they all connect together and we tell the story. Why is it in process that we have to make the CEO understand how to read a physical data model that we're using to implement a system? And we say that anyone in process, the Six Sigma, the Lean, all those of us that don't understand that are just being stupid, and that you can make me understand. I don't need to. You're giving me a model that no longer represents what I do. Why don't we separate the concerns? If we separated the concerns, everyone could talk at a level that each of them understood. Everyone can then create a more detailed view. And I like some language that, years ago when I was at Mega, they used language, made a lot of sense, and said, look, we shouldn't be using the OO method of inheritance. We should be using the language of described by. So this conceptual model with blue lines and green boxes is described by this logical model, which for argument's sake is going to use an ERD notation, just for the sake of argument, which is described by this BPMN model. Oh, right, so they don't even need to be the same notation because it's a described by relationship, but we get so hung up and say, but I'm cleverer than that. I've done my PhD, I've read all the books, I can make it different. And then we say, well, if you can do that, you do that, and we're doing that over there. What's changing today is that now people are saying, well, actually, yeah, we're doing the Lean and the Six Sigma, and we should look at how to bring, and we're starting to bring in that automation. So the low code, no code, and the lighter, more collaborative process modeling solutions, I think, are finally causing the traditional process improvement community to recognize that there are usable, valuable tools which they can use to address the problems that they perceive and not be forced to use the overweight, overly heavy, prescriptive technology tooling that they were told to use, and they can work to their own roadmap and time frame, not somebody else's.
Mark, what a great coverage there. I appreciate that. I mean, it's always amazing how time flies when I'm talking to you. It's always a master class, and I really very much appreciate your insights and you as a leader. So thank you so much on behalf of our global community today. Grateful to have you share your wisdom and expertise.
My pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mark McGregor, always a masterclass on the history, on the people, and the processes and technology and systems that are required for true intelligent business process management. We're going to be taking a break now, and we're going to be back at the top of the hour with a wrap up on great enduring organizations and how do they leverage ideas, methods, technologies, and people for outstanding performance. So I'll see you back at the top of the hour for our final wrap-up session.